that relates to professional football and that I played in Kansas City for a number of years. Also, as it relates to our speaker, I also happen to be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So that's who I am as I speak to you this evening. Alan Page, as it relates to the program I believe that you have, is an outstanding individual as it relates not only, as he speaks here this evening, and starting with the world of sport and his background, but I have a unique perspective because I've known Alan since 1967 when we both started in the National Football League. I always appreciated the uniqueness of this young man's talent, not athletically but academically, in his pursuits away from football. To think of someone who could go on to law school during the time he was performing at an extremely high level in the world of sport, but also his uniqueness is in his interest in education, which has gone on for many years. This is his second time in Richmond. The first time he came to Richmond was under my invitation, because I also have a scholarship fund that relates to education and has benefited many Richmond public school students over the last 13 years. He came in, he spoke, he presented, and has continued to do that kind of mission throughout his work, even today. One last point about Alan to give a little bit better view of the individual. Those of us who have the opportunity to be named to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, many of us ask someone from the world of sport to be our presenter. Alan Page asked an individual involved with his foundation, Willie Lanier, a principal at a school in Minneapolis, to present him in Canton, Ohio. With great pleasure, I take this evening to introduce to you the Associate Justice from the Minnesota Supreme Court, Justice Alan Page.
Thank you, Willie, for that kind introduction, and you for the warm welcome. Thank you also for allowing me to share my thoughts with you this evening as part of the Leadership Forum. What I'd like to do is talk about the future, about hope, and ultimately that the role that each one of us here this evening can play in making the future brighter and better. I'd like to do that in the context of the journey to where I am today. You see, I believe that children are the future, and that the future is mostly about hope. Yet we live in a time when the future seems most uncertain, especially for children, and particularly for children of color. Intertwined with that uncertainty are issues of violence and issues of race. Now clearly, with respect to race, some things have changed over the years. One area where there has been tremendous change has been in the area of sport, where people of color have achieved some degree of equal opportunity. The changes have been so dramatic that we often look to sport to see what lessons they hold for the rest of society. We have seen increased opportunity for people of color as players, both at the amateur and the professional levels. This is particularly true for African American males. Unfortunately, opportunities still lag behind when it comes to off-field roles such as coaching, management, and ownership. Increased opportunity for a few on the playing field is good, but quite frankly, having a few additional young black millionaires in the grand scheme of things does not mean a whole lot, especially when one of the results is that it perpetuates the myth for poor children that perfecting their athletic skills to the exclusion of their academic and intellectual abilities will allow them to grasp the golden ring that will pull them up and out of poverty and away from discrimination. Now, whatever success we've had in sport, and with issues relating to race, we have not had the same success in society at large. Although certainly we have made progress in society at large also, there is still a lot to be done when it comes to equal opportunity. Certainly my success, if you will, of being elected to the Minnesota Supreme Court, a state where the population, the minority population, is exceedingly small, is a tribute to the fact that we have changed. Because 50 years ago, in some places across this country, it wouldn't matter what the population was. Somebody like me just could not be elected, appointed, or otherwise obtain such a position. I think the key lesson to be learned with respect to sport is that when we put out, or when we have a level playing field, people of color can perform. The challenge that we face is to level the non-sports playing field. Now, in addition to race, children today are growing up in what seems to be an increasingly violent world. There is obviously the violence of guns and gangs, but also the violence of hunger, of homelessness, drug and alcohol abuse, child abuse, intolerance, and hatred. Sadly, hatred based not only on race, but also on gender, sexual orientation, age, ability, and disability is all too alive and well. This violence continues to have a disproportionate impact on people of color. One area of particular concern to me is the violence of our criminal justice system, which seems at times to be more interested in putting children of color in jail than helping them succeed. Young men of color disproportionately fill our jails and prisons across the country. Interestingly, studies show a direct correlation between educational achievement and incarceration rates. Thus, it would seem that if we are to make the future better and brighter, we must prepare children for that future. We must educate our children. Indeed, next to love, education is the most powerful and lasting gift that we can give to children. Oh, there are still plenty of opportunities for people who are prepared. The challenge is to help young people see opportunities for themselves, and then keep them engaged long enough so that, with the learning process long enough, so that they will be prepared when the opportunities arise. Because without preparation, opportunity is an empty promise. Now, thinking about success, to the extent that I've had any, whether on the athletic field or in the law or any place else, it has been due to some degree to being prepared and being focused, being able to keep my eye on the ball, so to speak. It has also been due in large measure to those people who helped mold and shape me as a person along the way. Now, thinking about preparation, I'm reminded of law school, where I learned some important lessons about preparation during my first year's contracts class. Now, instead of lecturing, my professor believed strongly in the Socratic method of teaching, which, as you may know, entails asking questions of those of us who are under-enlightened to help lead us to enlightenment, and includes a little intimidation along the way. Now, even though I always came to class relatively well prepared and had performed as a football player in front of hundreds of thousands of people, I was absolutely panicked that this professor would call on me. Making myself small and inconspicuous was not one of the choices. Now, after surviving the first few days, I began to notice that this professor only called on those students who looked like they were afraid, and he never called on students who raised their hands. So I started raising my hand. And for a while, this tactic was rewarded. But then finally, as things would have it, one day I raised my hand and he called on me. Without thinking, I stood up to answer the question, and my mind went blank, and it stayed blank. As I scrambled for a cohesive thought, I had momentary empathy for all those quarterbacks that I'd been chasing for a living. And then somehow it hit me. I had to say something. Anything was better than silence. So I started speaking. And I don't remember what my answer was, but it must have been okay. But that experience taught me some, as I say, some important lessons. First, that preparation is critical, absolutely critical to success. And while good preparation means coming to class with your assignments done, at least in that context, it also means being able to size up a situation and respond appropriately. Second, I learned that sometimes we create our own greatest obstacles, that our fears, rather than the actual situation, is what limits us. And third, and maybe this is the most important lesson, that even when our fears cause us to stumble, good preparation will pick us back up. Now, over the years, I've spent a lot of time in schools and classrooms, and I've come to the conclusion that the most important thing we can do to begin to solve some of the serious problems that we face as a society is to ensure, as I say, that every child has the opportunity to learn. Now, I have seen that firsthand, up front, close and personal with my involvement with the Page Education Foundation. The foundation is an organization that my wife and some friends and I started about 13 years ago with the goal of motivating, encouraging, and assisting young men and women of color pursue their education beyond high school. We thought we could do that by, one, providing financial assistance. Although we don't provide full scholarships, our scholarship grants range in amount from, I believe it's $950 up to $2,500. But more importantly, we require our grant recipients to go back into their community or the community where they're going to school and work with young children as tutors, as mentors, and role models. Sending the message to those young children, kindergarten through 8th grade, sending the strong, clear message that education is important and that somebody like you from your neighborhood, somebody that you know is being successful, and if they can do it, you can do it. We started off the first year with 10 scholars. This past year we have, this current year I should say, we have 535 scholars. That first year they work in various community-based organizations across the state. That first year our scholars worked with roughly 100 students, roughly 10 per scholar. This year over 6,000 children will be impacted by our scholars. Now, I suspect by now you're asking yourselves, how is it that you're sitting here on President's Day evening listening to a former football player, defensive lineman that, talking about education. After all, we know that football players, at least we have the stereotype of the football player being not necessarily the brightest bulb on the porch. And indeed, we tend to categorize them as dumb jocks. And we know for a fact that all defensive linemen have been hit in the head at least one too many times. In reality, I became interested in the topic and the issue of education a long, long time ago. As a child, I had parents who knew and understood the importance of education and who made sure that I understood it also. They, along with other family members, were my role models. And as role models, they made it clear to me by word and deed that if I was going to have a better life than they had, then I had to be educated. And I also had to be a good citizen. Yet over the years as a football player, I saw far too many young men who were great athletes, but who did not perform particularly well academically, and sometimes weren't good citizens. Now, on the educational side, it seemed to me that given what it takes to be a good athlete, one could also be a good student if one was willing to put in the same amount of time, the same amount of energy, and the same amount of effort. Not that you would necessarily end up at the top of the class, but you could certainly perform in ways that would allow you the opportunity for success. And so over the years, I had a difficult time, a very difficult time, figuring out this conflict between athletics and academics. Finally, my last year with the Minnesota Vikings, 1978, sort of, at least for me, it crystallized where and what the problem was. When I arrived at training camp late that year, we had new defensive coaches, both defensive coordinator and the defensive line coach. And the defensive line coach thought that the way to teach Jim Marshall, Carl Eller, and myself how to be better football players was to have us read the playbook to each other in our team meetings at night. Now, I know Mr. Lanier has had occasion to see an NFL playbook. I don't know how many others of you have, but the difficult words in those playbooks are offense, defense, block, tackle. Well, there were 9 defensive linemen in that group, and 4 of them could not read that playbook. And it was that point which it became clear to me that the problem was an academic problem, not an athletic problem. And it became clear to me because each one of these young men, who really struggled to read this playbook, each one of them had spent anywhere from 3 to 5 years at some of this nation's best post-secondary academic institutions. Each one of them had graduated from high school. But, I didn't learn how to read in college. I didn't learn how to read in high school. I learned how to read in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade. Those young men were not athletes when they missed out on learning how to read. And it became clear to me that at that point that, they were just the tip of the iceberg, and that there are literally hundreds of thousands of other children who they grew up with and who grow up every year who aren't learning even the most basic of academic skills. And it was at that point that it crystallized for me an area where I think, at least I thought at the time and continue to think, that I could have an impact on our society. And that is working to ensure that all children are prepared. We should not let our children's preparation create opportunity as an empty promise for them. We must make sure that, as I say, their education does not become one of those empty promises I talked about. Now, how can we do this? Well, I believe that each of us, if we're willing to make a commitment to work with children, can have an impact. That commitment not just to develop their hook shots or their throwing arm, but to develop their reading and their thinking abilities. We can insist that children take school seriously, then encourage them, reward them, and praise them for their academic achievements. Honor students and teachers who excel with the same rewards that we honor our players and coaches with. We can all spend time in a classroom in a local school. Talk to children about either your career or your career aspirations and how you got to or plan to get to where you want to go. Tutor a child who is struggling to read or write. Talk to children about your goals and dreams and how you've turned them into reality. Help prepare them so that when they are called on to speak, they will be able to respond. Now, as I said, I was lucky. I had good, strong, positive role models. Of course, as many of you well know, there are thousands of children here in Richmond and across the country who are not so lucky. Too often their idea of a role model is the latest athlete to sign a multi-million-dollar contract, or some television star, or worse yet, some street-hustling drug dealer. Let me be clear about one thing. Being a gifted athlete, having athletic ability, being a motor genius, if you will, may make one worthy of recognition, but it does not necessarily make one a role model. It seems to me that we should be choosing our role models by the content of their character. Now, as a nation, we were not doing that in 1963 when Dr. Martin Luther King spoke those words, and we are not doing it today. We must turn our attention away from those people with high visibility whose actions and words belie the bankrupt nature of their character. Instead, let us look to all of those good people across this country and the good that they are doing, those people who are in our own backyards, who live in our neighborhoods. Every day in any given community, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of decent Americans who provide real opportunities for creating and sustaining hope for the future. These are not the shallow heroes who offer hope with promises of winning the lottery, becoming a rap star, or pulling down backboards in the NBA, or making endorsements in other pro sports. These are simply men and women, young and old, who get up every morning and do the things that good citizens do. We have to teach our children the values that these people represent. We have the opportunity to influence children's choices of who they look up to. We simply have to decide whether we have the will to do so. Now, in addition to educating children and providing them good role models, I believe we must also work to develop their character. And the best way to do that is by example. The American Heritage Dictionary defines character as moral or ethical strength, integrity, fortitude. In a sense, character is who we are at our very core. It's what determines what we believe and how we choose to respond to any given situation. Character is not something that we're born with, nor does it develop automatically. It must be consciously developed. Character is also not something that is static. Whether you're 50 or 15, or 5 or 75, whether you're one of the University of Richmond students, high school student, elementary school student, member of the faculty or staff here at the University of Richmond, or a Supreme Court justice, we will all be forced to reevaluate and renew our character again and again. Now, people of character take responsibility for who they are and what they do. To resist the pressures and temptations that seduce us to make the easy choices rather than the right choices. To be a person of character takes a strong person. Now, I don't mean strong in the physical sense, for physical stature really has nothing to do with character. I do mean strong in the sense of believing that each one of us has an obligation to act in ways that build rather than diminishes our character and the character of those around us. What does that mean? It means being honest and being trustworthy, not being a hypocrite, saying what we mean and meaning what we say. It means keeping our promises. It means playing fairly, telling the truth, making decisions with others in mind, always treating other people with respect, and respecting ourselves. It means, at its core, it means working to figure out the difference between right and wrong, and then acting accordingly. Now, the fact that I was once considered to be a great football player, or that I am currently a Minnesota Supreme Court justice, doesn't by itself mean that I am a man of good character. The fact that the color of my skin is different from yours doesn't mean that I am not a man of good character. The fact that your language or religion is different from mine doesn't make either one of our characters better or worse. The outward differences which identify us as individuals do not change the content of our character. Now, it's all too easy to get hung up on the differences that we see in people, the differences that we see on the outside. Indeed, too often different becomes a substitute or another word for inferior. We see people who are like us as good and people who are different from us as bad. True understanding, however, can only come about when we're willing to look beyond the packaging and focus on what's really important, what's inside. The need for true understanding and the acceptance that often follows has never been greater. In my mind, the tragic events of 11 September stem from an inability on some very basic level to connect with other people. If we as a nation, indeed as a world of nations, are going to survive, we need to learn how to live with one another. Interestingly, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. understood this very well. There's a quote that he made, a statement that he made in 1956 in a sermon that is so fitting that I would like to share it with you. What he said is, and I quote, "More than ever before, people of all races and nations are today challenged to be neighborly. The call for a worldwide good neighbor policy is more than an ephemeral shibboleth. It is the call to a way of life which will transform our imminent cosmic elegy into a psalm of creative fulfillment. No longer can we afford the luxury of passing by on the other side. Such folly was once called moral failure. Today, it will lead to universal suicide. We cannot long survive spiritually separated in a world that is geographically together." Think about those words from 1956. Now, I understand that the problems that we face, whether we're talking about problems in education, problems of character, or problems of race, they can seem overwhelming and at times out of control. And we tend to assume that big problems, well, we need big solutions. I happen to believe that there are solutions for these problems and that we can get them under control. Ultimately, these are people problems, and the most effective solutions will be found in people like each one of us here this evening. Now, some would say, as I suggested, that the problems are too big and too complex for one person to have an impact. I believe that those people are wrong. You don't need to be a Supreme Court justice, a distinguished attorney, or even a football hero to make change happen. Everyone here, and I will emphasize again, everyone here, has the ability and the opportunity, and I believe the obligation, to make this world a better place. All we have to do is act. A quote from Robert Kennedy, taken from a speech that he gave in 1966 at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, symbolizes for me the impact that individuals can have when they're willing to act. It has special meaning, I think, when we consider the changes that have taken place in South Africa since he gave that speech in 1966. What he said was this: each time a man, and I would add a woman, stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Simply put, when we put our hearts, our minds, and our bodies to the task, especially when we become involved in the lives of the children around us, we can ensure educational opportunity. We can provide good role models, and we can develop character. And in the process, I believe we can change the future. And that is the challenge I leave you with this evening. Thank you. I see we have microphones at the front of each aisle for those who have questions. I would invite those who have questions to come forward. And if you don't get any invitations, I will remind you of that Socratic method that I was talking about earlier. We have one. Yes.
Hi, my name's Tristan. I'm just honored to be here tonight. I think I have your football card at home somewhere that I can show you. But the question I was wondering is basically two of them, is that with all the problems and things in society and just the breakdown of the family, sanctity of marriage, and everything that contributes to, you know, poverty and all the problems in society, do you feel that a deeper respect of God and religious values and living according to the Bible is something that would take care of all that? Is God the answer to all those problems? And then the second question was, what sort of faith or religious background did you come up with, if any, and how did that help you, guide you as becoming a mighty man in society?
Let me begin with the second part. I am how do I describe this? A fallen away Catholic, former Baptist. I don't know that I spend a lot of time focused on or thinking about God's role, if you will. Certainly the values that I was taught as a Catholic, as a Baptist, are values that I think are values that have been critical in my development. But talking about values is one thing. The question is how we act on them. And simply, how do I say this? Simply being religious without acting in a way that you live the values that we've all been taught, or live the values that have been taught. It seems to me to be not only hypocritical, but not terribly productive. One of the reasons, I suppose, not that much interested in sharing my religious views with anybody. I happen to be one of those who thinks that each of us deals with our religion in very personal ways, and I'm not inclined to share mine with anybody. But to the extent that I'm here and talking about it, it strikes me that one of the reasons I'm, if you will, a fallen away Catholic is because over the years I saw and sort of heard the values being taught one way every Sunday, and the actions on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday were totally inconsistent. And so I'm more interested in applying the values than I am with the labels and the need to be a part of some particular group. The question is whether, as individuals, we are going to lead moral lives. That's really the question. And everybody has the ability to do that. And you know, getting into a discussion about religion and which religion is right and which is wrong and what's good and what's bad and all that seems to me to be a distraction from the real question. Do we lead moral lives? Other questions?
Hello, Justice Page. It's an honor to meet you. I have a question. Whereas I believe, of course, I agree with you entirely that it's incumbent upon each individual to act in his or her community. What can we do societally, though, to correct some of the imbalances, especially in educational opportunity, given that our public education system is largely funded by property taxes, so we're going to have inherently disparate educational opportunities? What can we do societally to correct that imbalance?
I laugh because the question takes me down a road that I might want to avoid, not because I don't have some views, but because as a judge, there are certain things that I should and shouldn't talk about. But I think I can say, in terms of education at least, we know in education what works. There is no question about that. The only question is, as a society, put aside the resources that we put into it. Are we willing to do what works? And to date, or at least currently, it seems like we're not willing to do that. And I think that holds true no matter what the resource issues are, whether there are lots of resources or not so great resources. You know, in addition, you know, education is a sort of a fundamental problem. And it is one area where we can begin to attack some of the other problems that we face societally. That notion that educational achievement or lack thereof corresponds to incarceration rates, that ought to get our attention. For not the least of which reason is that it costs an awful lot of money to incarcerate people. On top of that, there's the trauma that the acts that cause people to be incarcerated, the trauma that those inflict on a society. The other thing I will tell you is I really believe that these issues are people issues. And at some level, clearly having resources is important, but at some level, all the money in the world won't solve these problems if we as individuals aren't involved up to our elbows in making change happen.
Good evening, I'm Lamar Smith. I'm from a senior at Richmond Public School. Anyway, I just like to ask one question. If there's one thing you could change in this world or in our public school system, what would it be?
There was one thing I could change. You know, when it comes to education, there are so many issues. Hard to be focused on learning when you're hungry. Hard to be focused on learning when you're being abused. Hard to focus on learning when you're living out of a car. If you're lucky enough to live out of a car. There are so many things that need changing that I suppose, consistent with my view of where the solution lies, if I could get people involved on a personal level, that would be the one thing. In fact, that is the message that I constantly give. That's where I believe that the change will come. There is no magic to any of this, unless you think hard work and commitment is magic. But there are no easy answers other than getting people involved and working to solve problems. Won't they let anybody on this side of the room ask a question?
Beauty before age.
Thank you. And thank you so much for coming to us this page. We really appreciate it. And I just totally respect what you're doing. I'm a junior here at University of Richmond, and I intend to be a teacher in the public inner city schools. And I'm a little apprehensive because I'll be student teaching in the city schools next fall. And I really went back and forth about whether to teach secondary or primary. And there's such a difference there because primary is so much prevention, while secondary is so much intervention. And I was wondering, how does your program address that, or how would you address just the great difference once inner city kids tend to hit middle school and leave like this bastion of safety in like what happens, what can we do to prevent what happens in middle school and the great dropout rates in high school?
Well, the Page Education Foundation focuses on kindergarten through 8th graders. We focus on the young ones. And by the way, I appreciate the fact that you're going to be a teacher. My youngest daughter is in graduate school to be an elementary school teacher, and she wants to teach in inner city schools. So I know the challenges that are ahead for you. In fact, she just started her student teaching this last quarter. She's in New York City at PS 43, and with kindergartners, no less. You have an exciting and challenging time ahead of you. It seems to me that where we can have the most impact is in the early years, because that's where children are most willing and wanting to learn. I happen to think that most kids, when they're real young, they're like sponges. They are willing to absorb everything we teach them, or willing to teach them, can teach them. Somewhere along the way, with far too many children, turn off the light switch. They, children aren't, even the ones that aren't being successful in school, they're not dumb. They understand what's happening to them. They know, they realize that they are being left behind. And I think some of what we see as they get older, the dropping out, the rebellion, the antisocial behavior, has something to do with the fact that they understand what's happened to them. And they're not happy. How we solve that in the first instance, we can put them in the position so that when they get older, they are up to speed. They're not playing catch-up. Strikes me that in terms of those who need to play catch-up, having me as a tutor, or you as a tutor, pretty valuable thing. Personal involvement with children of all ages, I think, can play a pretty significant role in keeping them enfranchised, keeping them involved in the system.
Judge Page, Richmond is the home of Arthur Robert Ashe Jr., a great promotional symbol for the Aetna Life Insurance Company. When they had its first outstanding prestigious award, you were chosen to be the recipient of that. You and Arthur Ashe had a tremendous capacity to serve. Did you know him?
Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to meet Arthur Ashe. From afar, I watched him, I admired him, I respected him, and I grew strength from his courage and from his strength. He was one incredible human being. One incredible human being.
Justice Page, thank you for coming tonight. You largely answered my question when you answered Mary Ann's question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it's a little different. Is working with young children, is that going to be enough to get them to change their role models from people with multi-million-dollar salaries or drug dealers who make lots of money on the streets, when the money is what their needs are at the moment? When they value money the way that we value higher ideals, can we really expect them to accept our values?
Well, I don't know that we need to get them to accept our values, but it strikes me that at some level they're going to have to come to grips with some of the realities. And the reality is that most kids aren't going to become professional athletes. I don't care how talented they are, how hard they work or don't work. The reality is that in all of professional sports, there may be, I don't know what, 6,000 jobs in a country of 220 or 30 or 50, 250 million people. Competition's pretty keen for those slots. And on any given day, most of them are filled. Most of them are filled. So I think we need to and not that it's wrong or not a good thing for children to aspire to athletics or whatever else it may be, but coupled with a good dose of reality, the best of all worlds, I think I can speak to this, is having success on the athletic field and having it off at the athletic field. The other reality is that the real role models, we talk about the athletes and the movie stars and everybody else, but that's not who impacts people. It's people that we can reach out and touch, people that we can speak to, people that we know. And so you're fortunate here in Richmond to have a Willie Lanier. But how many people in Richmond can reach out and touch Willie Lanier? I'm sure you have other athletes also. But how many people can reach out and touch those athletes? We reach out and touch on a regular basis the people who we know. And they're the ones that ultimately will influence how we act. We spend a lot of time talking on and writing about and focusing on athletes as role models. Some of the conduct that some athletes engage in, and not that many, but enough, that they engage in, that to suggest that as a group they ought to be role models is rather frightening. Unless we're talking about negative role models. There are plenty of those around. Okay,
What changes do you want to see happen in the U.S. Justice Department, especially with regard to the disproportionate incarceration rates between the races that you spoke of?
What would I like to see? Well, I can't speak to the U.S. Department of Justice, but I can speak to Minnesota's court system, our judicial system. When I joined the court in 1993, we had just, or shortly after I joined the court, we completed a study of racial bias in our judicial system. What that study found was that people of color are arrested more often, charged more often, longer sentences, higher bail, clear disparate treatment. We have been working since that report to eliminate the bias in our system. We've done lots of little things. I think the report had roughly 40 recommendations, and we've implemented quite a few of them. We haven't changed a whole lot. But one of the recommendations, which we are just starting to implement, is to collect race-specific data on everybody who comes into the courts, whether it's criminal, juvenile, civil, what have you. Everybody that comes in the door, we are collecting data with respect to race. We're doing that so that we can identify precisely where, if at all, discrimination takes place. With the ability to analyze data today, we're pretty close to the point where we can spot individual problems. And once we get enough of a database, we are going to act where we see problems. That's one thing that is critical. To date, the lack of data, we all have stories, it's all anecdotal, but nobody can ever pinpoint what the problem or where the problem is. We have a sense of what the problem is, but we have a hard time pinpointing precisely where it is. You know, it's the system. Well, the system has lots of components. What part of the system? And who in the system? Once we identify that, then maybe we can make change. one of the things we've done, interestingly, we have required lawyers in Minnesota to take, our lawyers are required to take continuing education credits. Can't remember whether it's 3 or 4 years ago. We added 2 requirements. They're required to take a total of 45 credits every 3 years, roughly 15 credits a year. I believe it was 4 years ago, we included in that 45 credit requirement that there be 3 credits of bias elimination and 3 credits of ethical conduct, on ethical conduct. Interestingly, nobody's challenged the credits on ethical conduct. We've had a number of people who challenged the bias elimination credits under the guise of they're really just being thought police. We want people to think a certain way. The reality is that at least this is one justice who really doesn't care how people think. They can be as biased in their thought as they would like. But I do care how they treat people. And it seems to me that we can't control what people think. We have to be able to control how they act. And when their actions are biased, we have to be able to act on that. And that's just one more area where we're bringing change. The subject is so broad I can't get into everything we're doing, but there is need from within. You know, our judicial system is the one branch of government that is designed and intended to treat everybody fairly. And ours in Minnesota doesn't. Sad fact is that of the other states across the nation that have done those studies, theirs don't. Yes.
Thank you for being here. I'd like to get your opinion on 2 of the greatest solutions that we keep hearing about in the media. One being the standards of learning exams, and 2 being charter schools or vouchers for schools. Thank you.
Good question. I can't go there. That is an issue that has come in front of our court before and will likely come again. So it would be inappropriate for me to comment.
How you doing?
Good.
You said education is the base for us youth today. Well, I want to know, what are some of the things that you think we need to do to stay focused, I mean, with all the problems that we have, with all the pressures we have today? And what are some of the things that you did to, get away from all the pressure?
One of the things I think, one of our failures is with young people connecting what goes on in the classroom on a personal level. What does it mean when I'm sitting there struggling with diagramming this sentence or figuring out this math problem? What does that mean to me in the real world? Well, in the short run, it means a lot of pain and suffering trying to figure it out. But in the long run, where does that take me? What it does is it builds the foundation for whatever it is our hopes and dreams are for the future. And I think if we can, with young people, connect where they're going to be down the road with what they're doing today, in some sense showing them their self-interest. What is my self-interest in figuring out this math problem? then I think if we can make that connection, we can keep people engaged. And if we can keep them engaged, the longer we can keep them engaged, it seems to me, the better prepared they will be. And so when I talk to kids, young people, I talk about what is it that you're looking, what are your hopes and dreams? Where do you think you're going in life? And then you sort of draw that out, and then have a discussion about, well, what do I then have to do to get there? I think when we connect people in concrete ways with what all this means to them, not just in the short term, but in the long term, I think it can have a positive influence. That was one of the things when I was a youngster. I can remember people would come in and talk to us, and they never made that connection for me. And it was something that I was sort of always looking for. Now, what does this mean in the real world? I think we can and should focus on that a little bit more.
Thank you for coming. With the enormous time commitment that comes with the legal profession, do you have a lot of time to work with individual students in the elementary and middle school levels? And in addition, do you have any particular success stories with a certain protege that you feel particularly proud about his achievement after your interaction with him?
As a judge, we do have a lot of work. It does take a lot of time, but I know people are quite capable of doing more than one thing at a time. As I mentioned, I spend a fair amount of time in classrooms. Oftentimes it's just visiting one class or another, but I'm fortunate enough, we, as part of the Page Foundation, we require our scholars to be involved in community-based community service programs, or service programs. I have the good fortune that our court, our judicial system, in fact, our state law librarian has been very instrumental in setting up a relationship between the people in our judicial center, which holds our judicial administrative offices, our Supreme Court and our Intermediate Court of Appeals, and our state law library. Set up a relationship with Benjamin E. Mays Elementary School in St. Paul, Minnesota, where once a week we are in a program called Everybody Wins. Once a week I go on days that I'm not in court, and I share these responsibilities currently with my current secretary. She goes when I can't, I go when she can't. We have a young man that we work with 1 hour a week, every week during the school year, second graders, reading. They're called our reading buddies. My reading buddy happens to be a young man by the name of Saw Henderson, who reads pretty well and is really very fulfilling to be a part of helping him improve reading with him and to him. He picks the books, I read part, he reads. I read to him, he reads to me. When I slip up, he corrects me. When he slips up, I usually don't have to correct him because he catches it. He's very good. This is the 4th year that I've been involved in with Everybody Wins. I've had, interestingly, 3 good readers. These are kids that I've stayed in contact with over the years. and we've developed more than just over time, more than just a reading relationship. One young student, the fourth one, struggled to read. And so just being there on a weekly basis, reading to her and working with her as she read to me was very important. Not only for her, but for me. The reality is that being involved in whatever kind of service one might be involved in, the reality is that there's this tendency to think that you are doing for somebody else. In large measure, somebody else is really doing for you. One of the nice things about the title of our reading program is everybody wins, and everybody does.
Good evening. Thank you for coming to speak with us once again. My question is, you taught us you told us about your experience in helping children and how we can do the same on a personal level. On a state and national level, what policies do you see can be enacted and to influence the education of our youth today? And how can we as the constituents influence our policymakers to enact those?
Let me just say, I think getting into the policy debate would probably lead me down a path that I shouldn't go. Having said that, and don't get me wrong, there is absolutely a role for the state and federal government. But quite frankly, if we're going to sit around and wait for the state and federal government to solve these problems, I don't have a lot of confidence that we'll solve them in my lifetime, much less yours or your grandchildren's grandchildren. I believe that we have to solve it. And so whatever the national policy is, if we don't get involved, I don't think it will make much difference, quite frankly. Any other questions?
I have many, but I'll try to limit them. Number one, of course, who were your role models when you were growing up? And with all the advances and improvements that we've made in society, are things harder today than they were? Are values less important than they used to be?
My role models, my heroes were my parents. Simple as that. That's who I looked up to. Life is difficult today. Life was always difficult, but today it's difficult at a faster pace. We have less time to reflect on our experiences. I happen to believe that loss of reflection may be some part of what contributes to, I don't know if there are more problems, but the different nature of the problem. We don't have time to think about our actions. We want everything instantaneously. We want instant gratification. We want instant responses. So that the government changes somewhere, and 3 days later we're wondering why things aren't better. The world just doesn't work that way. But yet we have this mindset that things will change overnight. They don't. And the inability to stop and reflect and consider the better way, whatever that may be, or if there is a better way, because there may not be one. The inability to spend the time thinking about it. I think that's a big loss. One of the things that I love about being an appellate court judge, as an example, is appellate court judges have more time, have more ability to reflect on what they do and the decisions they make than do trial court judges. I dare say I probably could do the work of a trial court judge, but I wouldn't be very comfortable doing it. I like having that time to think and to sort of work through the possibilities. And I think that loss of the ability to do that on a sort of a global scale is a loss that probably hurts us in the long run. Well, let me just say thank you for being here this evening. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts and ideas. Hopefully, and I say hopefully, I'm one that has a lot of hope. Hopefully the problems that exist will be viewed by all of you as an opportunity to do something that will bring about change. I think when we view those problems as opportunities, then we can have some hope for the future. If we don't view them as opportunities, I wonder if there's anything left but despair. Thank you.
I'm Fred Jablin, Acting Dean of the Jepson School, and I just once again would like to thank Justice Page for sharing his thoughts with us tonight about leadership, sports, and society, and for his very inspiring comments with respect to the opportunities that are available for all of us to participate in improving the education of our youth and improving our society generally. Also, I'd like to express special thanks to Willie Lanier. I don't know if Willie's still back there, or Willie, for introducing Justice Page. Before closing this evening's program, I'd also like to take a moment to remind you that the final program in this year's Jepson Leadership Forum will be held on April 2nd at 7:30 p.m. in the Jepson Alumni Center. This program is focusing on coaching, motivating, and leading teams, topics that I think are very relevant to some of Justice Page's comments tonight. Richmond's head basketball coach, John B. Lyon, who's having a wonderful first year in the Atlantic 10, and UR Hall of Fame coach Dick Tarrant will share their insights about what works best to motivate and lead teams, and take questions in an interactive session moderated by the voice of the Spiders, Bob Black. Tickets are available at the Modlin Center box office. We hope to see you all there on April 2nd. Thanks again for joining us tonight, and have a safe trip home.